Welcome to Alaska Common Ground's Forum on the initiative to increase Alaska's minimum wage. I'm Cliff Rowe. I'm lucky enough to be the chair of Alaska Common Ground. Alaska Common Ground is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to getting Alaskans to come together and search for common ground on important public issues like this. So learn more about the issues and understand them better, and maybe even find consensus. I want to thank our sponsors tonight. I want to thank the Anchorage Public Library. I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Anchorage. I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Alaska. And finally, I want to thank Alaska Integrated Media, home of Valley News Talk KBNT and Hot Talk KOAN here in Anchorage. And I see Eddie Burke, one of their hosts here tonight. I also want to announce that this is the second of 4 forums Alaska Common Ground is holding this summer on the ballot propositions. You might have heard we had one on the oil tax referendum last week. It had perhaps a little bigger audience that we may be able to attract tonight. Next week, Wednesday, August 6th, we're holding a forum on the initiative regarding marijuana. And the week after that, on Wednesday, August 13th, we're holding a forum on the Bristol Bay Forever Initiative. And we're not stopping there, folks. On Saturday, October 4th, we're holding an all-day forum on Alaska's fiscal future. And I invite you to come to all of these events, to each of these events, which, like this one, are all free and open to the public. And if you want to learn more about our forums, you can go to www.akcommonground.org, and you can learn all about our future events, as well as about how you can get in on this. You could join Alaska Common Ground for a mere $35 a year for regular membership, and donate in other ways. You can also do that at the door here, either donate or join Alaska Common Ground and become a member. So tonight, our subject is the initiative to increase Alaska's minimum wage. And tonight, our moderator is a former board member of Alaska Common Ground, Taylor Brelsford. Taylor.
Thank you very much, Cliff, and thanks to all of you who've joined us on a brilliant sunny evening. I'd like to introduce our panelists, talk a little bit about the format of the evening, and then touch on a couple of ground rules to ensure that we proceed in the most positive way forward. Our panelists are both distinguished, knowledgeable people who will offer us a good deal of information. Ed Flanagan, on your right, has a career in public service as a former commissioner of labor and workforce development under Governor Tony Knowles. He has a historic connection to this issue, having led the administration's efforts on legislation instituting the last increase in minimum wage in 2002. He has a long-time history with the labor movement, and finally, he is one of the initiative sponsors, one of the organizers for the initiative to increase the minimum wage. Help me welcome Ed Flanagan, please. And now with us to discuss the opposing point of view to the initiative is Dr. Kyle Hampton, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Alaska and director of the UAA Center for Economic Education. His academic work includes some innovative areas in economics. You'll see details in the program. And it's also worth noting that he's been recognized as an exceptional teacher and one of the young talents in Alaska, one of Alaska's top 40 under 40. So Kyle, thank you for joining us. Please welcome Kyle Hampton as well. On format, we will start with opening presentations from the 2 presenters. First, in favor of the initiative, Ed Flanagan, followed by a position opposing the initiative, and that will be from Kyle. Hampton. Following the presentations, there will be a few minutes for direct exchange between the panelists, follow-up questions of one another, and then we will turn to questions from the audience. Again, I'd like to ask you to use the cards for written questions. We've got a couple of people who will circulate and collect those from you. Barbara Carlson is one, and Janet McCabe will be helping with collecting cards as well. Here she is. I want to mention one more time that the program is live streamed through 1080koan.com. It's recorded for posting on the Alaska Common Ground website, and it's also recorded for rebroadcast at KSKA. On ground rules, we're gathered together in an important purpose, and everything flows from sharing the goal and the purpose of an evening. So this is about informed citizenry as the strongest support of democracy. We all want to approach this from the standpoint of listening and learning new information, walking out of here more fully informed about one of the important public policy issues of our day. We want to approach this as a shared airtime, shared resource. Let's listen well to others. I would ask that folks, no matter how enthusiastic your point of view, refrain from interruptions or cheers and jeers along the way through the evening, if you would. And finally, this is probably a bit more for the panelists. We will try and move the forum along, so we will have some timelines, time frames, restraints on loquaciousness, if you will. And Dick Milius will be pulling up some little reminders as we're going to try and move through. So with that, I think we're ready to turn to Ed Flanagan for the presentation in favor of the initiative to raise the minimum wage.
Thank you, Taylor. And I'd like to thank Alaska Common Ground and all the sponsors. I've named them, but I'm on a time restraint here. I really appreciate not only this forum, but the series of forums. It's a great service as we approach both elections. I'd also like to thank Professor Hampton for providing an opposing view. To date, we don't have, at least that I'm aware of yet, a declared, registered opposition opposing group. Wouldn't be surprised if one arises, but wouldn't want to be here debating myself, at least I might think different when this is done, but glad to have him here representing an opposing view. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I know this isn't quite like last week's, but for as nice as the weather is out there, this is a very impressive turnout. So thank you for coming. I guess to get right into it, why increase the minimum wage and why do it now? Well, Alaska's minimum wage, as of coming January 1, will not have been increased in 5 years. And at that point, it was $7.75, which then was an inadequate minimum wage. We've got to differentiate between a minimum wage and a truly living wage, which is usually done on a local area concept. You've heard of Seattle. I hear a lot of talk about the $15. But for a statewide minimum wage, Alaska certainly has to have something that will provide for a better level of support for folks. Now, some quick history. I got to go quick because I tend to get bogged down in that old history major. But 1959, Alaska became, in the first legislature, the first state to enact its own minimum wage higher than the federal. First, right out of the chute, 1959 legislature. Federal minimum wage is $1. Alaska legislature said Alaska's $1.50. And given they even then much higher relative cost of living, it made a lot of sense. And it still did. And that kept Alaska at the top among the states for over 30 years. And close to the top of the top 3 through the last century. When the federal minimum wage, which for a long time had been periodically 2 or 3 times a decade adjusted, kind of stopped being a bipartisan effort. There were no raises through the whole Reagan presidency, 9 years. It really started to lose ground. More states addressed this with their own minimum wages. Washington and Oregon were the first to put a CPI or cost of living adjustment on it. And Alaska, there was enough interest in following suit. It was an attempted initiative that fell short. And then in 2001, Governor Knowles introduced a bill to increase the minimum wage from $5.65 to $7.15. The House Speaker at the time introduced a bill which ended up being a vehicle. Bill stalled. There was an initiative by the AFL-CIO that did not fail, got 50,000 signatures in about 3 months. And with that impetus, the legislature suddenly was interested in acting. And the bill passed nearly unanimously, about 6 no votes in the House and 1 no vote in the Senate. And Alaska's minimum wage was set then to go January 1, 2003, basically overnight. It had initially been a 2-phase, like ours is, a 2-year phase-in to allow businesses time to adjust and have a shock to the system. But at that point, because the year had been lost, it was all in one shot, 27% increase overnight to January 1st, 2003. The bill also called for, as passed, the cost of living adjustment to the Anchorage CPI, Consumer Price Index, on that annual adjustment, if the federal had gone up, it would always be at least $1 over the federal. Well, unfortunately, the legislature came back the next year, and I'm usually not accused of not being cynical enough when it comes to the actions of the legislature. They came back less than a year later and repealed the CPI and the COLA and the federal provision, basically gutting the bill, and really for 7 years, 6 years later, after that, 6.5 years, the minimum wage was frozen at $7.15. We continue to lose ground. We don't have to be the highest in the country, but we ought to be close to it. By 2009, we were about to be eclipsed by the federal minimum wage. It was going up to $7.25. So some legislators the Senate tried to get a $8.75 minimum wage, which is where it would have been if they hadn't reduced the CPI, repealed it in 2003. And then the CPI, and all they were able to get was a restoration of the 50 cents over federal. They put a 10-cent increase in to match the federal July. 5 years ago last week was the last federal increase to $7.25. And then on January 1st, 2010, the 50 cents over federal was restored. Of course, that premium now represents only 7% of the federal minimum wage. 1959, it's 50%. So next January 1st, if we don't act on this initiative, it will be 5 years since there's been an increase in the minimum wage. Now, last year around March, myself and two other former state labor commissioners, Jim Sampson of Fairbanks, Tom Cashin of Juneau, we grumbled for, I guess, 10 years about when was somebody going to fix this, and we finally realized that we were, 2 out of 3 of us were retired, and we ought to just go ahead and do it ourselves. So we formed the ad hoc ballot group under the state provisions, the state law for initiatives, Alaskans for fair minimum wage. We obviously didn't stay up all night thinking up the name, but that kind of said what we were looking to do. And we went through the hoops you do to get certified for the ballot through the Lieutenant Governor's office. And we had 150 volunteers collecting throughout the state, and we had significant funding from Alaska's labor unions, the vast majority of which don't represent workers in an industry that's even close to the minimum wage. They really support this as a public service and should be commended for it. And so we were able to hire a contractor like most successful efforts have done to use paid signature gatherers in Anchorage. And over the course of about 8 months, we got 43,500 signatures. Now, we had great response. All 3 sponsors collected signatures, and that was part of the plan, how to really get a good feel for what people thought about this issue, to prepare for the campaign, and to inform ourselves. We had to put something out there. You agonize over what amount to put out there. What we settled on doing was really taking the $7.15 that had been instituted in 2003 and pretty much acting as if the law had not been thwarted by the 2003 legislature, and came up to right about where we would have been. It would be $9.53 today an hour. We'd still be the highest in the country, 21 cents over Seattle's $9.32, had the legislature left well enough alone in 2003. As it turned out, they weren't willing to, or at least some of them weren't willing to leave well enough alone this year and tried to preempt us again with a bill. And we could not be blamed for expecting the same result as we had last 10 years ago. And Alaskans let the legislature know that they wanted a chance to vote on this, and they will have the chance to vote on it. Not in August, as was originally planned because of the overrun of the legislature, but in November. Like I said, we had great response. I collected signatures in some of the, what are generally recognized as some of the more conservative areas of the state. And when we talk about common ground, this is a neat issue because Alaskans, and especially in Juneau, we can't find an issue down there that we can't disagree on, 51-49 percentage-wise. But on this one, had really good response. People were very interested, very enthusiastic. Had a lot of people telling us we weren't going high enough, which kind of gave me some drafter's remorse that maybe we should have gone for 10 or 10-15. But we had a lot of Matsu Ketchikan. Ketchikan folks came up. They knew who paid minimum wage in town. Let you know it, and that they didn't think it was right. Had a lot of small business people come up, sign the petition, and say, heck yeah, I can't people. I'm a small business. I got 2 or 3 employees. But I can't, in good conscience, pay less than $10 an hour. And that was real informative. We'll be getting some ads, digital ads. We're not going to run much mainstream media with these folks in front of their businesses. And in Sitka, not talking about conservative places there, Sitka, for example, I had the same afternoon, I'm standing out in front of the post office. You know, you wear a sign, it's a Martian green, was the printer's color for the paper, minimum wage petition, kind of looked like a rodeo clown. But folks would come up and, you know, they knew what you were doing and they could walk around you if they didn't want to sign it. But in the same afternoon, I had 2 gallery owners, a lot of art galleries in Sydney. And they're open, well, this was before Christmas, but I think a lot of them are open year-round. Came up and said basically the same thing. Yeah, I got a gallery, and, you know, I pay my people at least $10 to start. In this town, I'm crazy to pay them less. That same afternoon, I had a worker from a 3rd gallery who said, yeah, I want to see this raised. I'm working for that gallery over there. I make $7.75 an hour. Well, what does this say? Here's 2 high-road employers, relatively high-road employers, that are suffering a competitive disadvantage from an employer right in the same block and selling the same type of materials who avails themselves of the absolute minimum they have to pay under the law. I mean, there's business support for this. Even, we'll get to opponents in a little bit, but you know, when you poll business groups that, you know, might even end up being the opposing view for the ballot pamphlets and things like that, 33% of their members will support this initiative. That happened historically, and it's showed up in one survey already of a business group that is generally opposed to this. Now, I said Alaska doesn't have to be number 1, but we sure as heck shouldn't be number 19. Here's where we stack up compared to the rest of the states and the District of Columbia right now. And look at that list. Arizona and Florida. Those are low-wage states where it's a heck of a lot cheaper to live than Alaska, and they've got a higher minimum wage than us. And because they've got a CPI adjustment, they're going to be higher still on January 1st. This shows us 19, as of September 1st. Michigan hasn't gone to 8.15 yet. California just went to 9. But if we don't pass the initiative, we'll be 21st place. We'll be behind West Virginia. This is patently absurd. And this was a real selling point with people when they saw this. Now, I got to admit, I had people come, you trying to raise it to $15? I said, no, that's Seattle. That's a different concept. We're trying to raise it. And I said, well, okay, they weren't happy with 15. I wouldn't propose a $15 minimum wage. It might piss some people off, but that are advocates. But at some point, the arguments that I can pretty much dismiss out of hand about job losses at a modest level like we're proposing, at some level, I don't know where, but at 15, they might actually have some truth to them. I can't just, you know, rebut them with the studies that we have. It'll be interesting to see what happens after Seattle. That'll be a real proving ground for other efforts, and maybe someday we need to have some local living wage ordinances in Alaska. But for the minimum wage, this proposal will put us, we won't be the top, but if we go to $9.75, and if the legislature leaves us alone, we get our CPI increases, we'll be amongst the top of the states, and that is more appropriate. We are the 4th, we're not the most expensive state anymore. That's good. We're the 4th most expensive state. But anyway, polls reflect strong support. 69% in the poll that the legislature did. Majority of all political parties, even the majority of Republicans, 52% I think in the Dittman poll that the legislature did. We've had really good support. You'll be seeing, starting probably around Labor Day, you know, we'll be announcing resolutions of support and sign-on from a significant element of the faith community, from various community organizations, of course, the unions. We're building the Alaska Needs a Raise Coalition, and we welcome inquiry or solicitation from anybody who would be interested in joining. Now, it's a great proposal. What's not to like? I mean, who could have a problem with the minimum wage? But you never know. I mean, it takes all kinds. We do have some groups that traditionally oppose it. In the past, it has been seafood processors. And, you know, it's their industry groups. They don't like government telling them what to do. I think I can understand it. But still, as a society, especially one that underwrites their low wages by subsidizing their employees. I mean, not picking on Walmart. Walmart in this state is not like in other states. They pay probably, I think, based on my experience with family members working for them and for other box stores, they started at about $1 over what we're proposing to raise it to. That wouldn't be the case if we were in other states. But Walmart, $6.2 billion that taxpayers pay so their employees can subsist on the wages they pay elsewhere. Fast food industry, $7 billion. I mean, this is a common sense approach to 2 minutes. Okay, here we go. I got to start talking like a New Yorker, folks. Get as much in as I can in the next 2 minutes. Now, conservative economists traditionally oppose it. It's basic theory that if you raise they cite that if you raise the cost of something, the demand is going to go down, and that includes labor. And of course, that's in a perfectly competitive market. But for a long time, the argument was mostly theoretical. They also say, inflation is going to be a problem. Well, Goldman Sachs just analyzed, not exactly a tool of the working class. Goldman Sachs just analyzed the federal $10.10 proposal and projected that the inflation effect would be probably something like 0.1%. But it's in the last 20 years, there have been empirical studies. Two guys, Card and Kruger. Kruger just stepped down as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. They said, hey, we've been doing this every 5 years at least since 1938. Did any of the stuff that they always say is going to happen? And they looked at, and there's been many studies now challenging that, replicating it, they're trying different spins on it. But they looked at 2 adjoining counties in different states. Jersey had raised it, their rate, Pennsylvania, in an area where it was a bi-state metropolitan area. What happened? And they surveyed a large number of fast food restaurants and found that actually, some people refer to it as the hamburger filter study, the employment went up in the fast food restaurants in the area where the wages had gone up. Because guess what? Low-wage people have more money to maybe go out once a week and buy a burger. There's been a whole lot it's almost an arms race in studies. There's a letter was sent to Congress supporting the federal proposal. It was signed by 600 PhD economists, including 7 Nobel laureates. 500 economists then signed a letter put together by the National Restaurant Association. I mean, we can let them duke it out at the national level. In Alaska, here's what we've got. Here's what happened. We have real-world experience. 2002 to 2003, total non-ag employment, that is all jobs, not uniform military, and not fishers, not self-employed. Monthly employment up. This is like a 27% increase overnight. And in the following year, both up. Employment, private sector employment, about the same numbers. But here, look at these low-wage industries. Identified the Department of Labor as the 4 main low-wage industries that employ low-wage, medium-wage, or low-wage workers. Seafood production, 5.9%. Other factors outcomes here, no doubt. 8.1% increase in wages. Retail trade, up. Accommodations, that's hotels. Food services and drinking, predictions of dire consequences if this bill passed without a so-called tip credit that lets restaurants pay less to their servers. 4.3 increase in wages. That's thousands of Alaskan workers able to have a better way of life because of basic protection provided by government.
And let me ask you to conclude there.
Okay.
We will have some additional exchanges, so I think we will have an opportunity for you to insert some additional points. Thanks very much. Obviously, a passionate, historic review of how this issue has unfolded in Alaska. I think what we'd like to do now is to turn to Professor Kyle Hampton. It'll take us just a second to get your presentation queued up. There we are.
All right, so the poll numbers typically are about 75% to 85% in favor of raising the minimum wage in the United States at any given time. So at least I hope you will give me some points for degree of difficulty.
Fair enough.
So when I was growing up, what drove me into economics were 2 questions that were raised in my mind. One was raised when I visited Washington, D.C., and I saw that money was printed in a machine. And I immediately thought to myself, well, why the hell don't we have another machine? That would be an obvious way to solve this problem. And the second question that occurred to me was more of a micro question. When I found out that there was this thing they called the minimum wage, I said, why isn't it $100? The reason why that joke died horribly. The reason why I have this picture, you might not be able to tell what this is. This is a seawall in Hawaii. And when I teach economics, one of the things that I like to focus on is the ecological nature of markets and the ecological nature of prices. In Hawaii, people would get upset when the ocean would come up so far that it would actually break over the beach and into their yards and kill their grass. And so their solution to that was to build walls. Still allowing themselves some amount of beach, but a wall so that when the sea really came up, it did not manage to get into the grass. The result of this was that when the ocean did come up to the wall, it's not like the ocean got to the wall and said, oh darn, I'm going back into the ocean. There was a force there, and that force, simply by putting up a wall, was not dissipated. In fact, what happened was it was driven downward, and it scours all the sand out, so the nice beach that you used to have is now gone. And I think this is an apt metaphor for these sorts of policies. This idea that if we are uncomfortable with a particular price, in this case, if we're uncomfortable with the fact that wages are too low. Now let me make it perfectly clear, especially for low-skilled and blue-collar workers in this country and in this state right now, we are going through a crisis of extremely low wages. On that, we can definitely find common grounds, absolutely. However, the idea that you can simply solve this problem by passing a law that says that employers have to pay more and that there's not some sort of ramification, not some sort of reaction to this is folly. Good intentions aren't good enough. In fact, when you put up a wall, like a price control, or in this case a price floor, this minimum wage, the same forces that would have given you that low wage are still there. They're just going to manifest themselves in different ways. Okay, so everybody has been out knitting, I assume. So I wanted to do a real quick experiment, because I do experiments actually in the classroom a lot. What I want to know is, for $5, how many of you would be willing to clean the fish that someone else had caught for them? If you would raise your hand. For $5 per fish. Yeah, okay, so, all right, how many of you would clean fish for $5? No? Sir, you said yes to both. Yeah. Oh, okay. All right, how about then $8? How many of you would be willing to clean a fish for $8 for your neighbor?
One single fish?
A single fish. And you can do as many as you like. Okay? And how many of you would pay $8 to have that fish cleaned? Okay, all right, so what we see here are two different prices, two different wages. In one case, we have an imbalance where we had more people willing to clean the fish than we had people willing to hire them to do so. And in the other case, we had the opposite situation. So, let me show you what happens here. You've got a wage of $10. And at that wage of $10, in this example, you can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 employers who are willing to hire at that wage. And you can see over here the employees, I don't know, it's a lot of them, okay? Now what I'm going to do is, the way prices actually emerge is when this imbalance takes place. When you have more employees than you have employers, then you expect there to be downward pressure on the wage. The reason why is because some of these employees know that they're not going to get any job if they're not willing to do so for less. And so this pushes down wages. So currently that imbalance is going to drive the wage down. And you can see that as the wage goes down to 9, we get a few more employers. We get a fewer employees. As the wage goes down further, at $8, we now have an equal number. If we overshoot, we get more employers than we have employees. If we overshoot further, the same imbalance occurs. And the idea here is, and trust me, I would give anything to be able to do supply and demand in 15 minutes, but I can't do it. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that the price is not some sort of, it's not a moral decision. It's not a moral decision that's being made by society. It is, in fact, very simply the price, the wage that balances the number of jobs with the number of workers. If you choose to have a wage, if you mandate a wage that is too high, then you're going to get that imbalance. You're going to have more people trying to get those high-paying jobs than you actually have jobs, and the result there is unemployment. The first federal minimum wage was enacted in 1938. It was about 25 cents. The U.S. Department of Labor later found that it resulted in an immediate job loss of between 30,000 and 50,000. However, Puerto Rico suffered the worst. Because their natural wage was actually around 4 cents to 5 cents per hour, the increase of the minimum wage to 25 cents actually resulted in job losses of 120,000 and an unemployment rate of 50%. I'm not bringing this up to suggest that this is what would happen in Alaska, merely to assert that this is not all dry theory, that this is in fact something that really happens, and that if you do push the minimum wage high enough, you will see these sorts of unemployment effects result. In fact, just recently, President Obama signed emergency legislation to postpone a minimum wage increase in American Samoa after the governor, after the governor begged for it, essentially. We are watching our economy burn down. We do not know what to do to stop it. We need to bring the aggressive wage cost decree by the federal government under control. Our job market is being torched, etc. The point is that President Obama did recognize that these increases in the minimum wage do have these effects on unemployment and acted to stop that minimum wage increase in American Samoa just recently. 1982. Now, as Ed referred, there's lots and lots of folks on both sides of the aisle having this fight. He mentioned Carter Kruger, and I'll come back to that shortly. Certainly, Newmark and Washer are the other side of this debate. But there's been lots of different, not just analyses, but meta-analyses. Folks who have actually gone through and not run their own study, but actually looked at older studies and tried to get some sort of idea of an overarching theme. In 1982, the Minimum Wage Study Commission found that a 10% increase in the minimum wage reduces teenage employment by 1 to 3%. This is not theoretical, this was data-driven. In 2006, Newmark and Washer looked at over 100 studies, 85% of which showed disemployment effect for low-skilled workers. In 2011, Fiskai and Rubenstein found that the minimum wage has notable wage impacts and enlarged the corresponding disemployment effects. They looked at lots and lots of different studies. And in 2014, just recently here in February, the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office came out and announced that an increase in the minimum wage to what is being proposed, $10.10, would result in the loss of 500,000 jobs. Oh, sorry. There's also been very little research on Alaska specifically, but a new working paper that's out right now from Hansen and Hawley demonstrate that a couple of facts about Alaska. One is that the number of workers affected by the proposed minimum wage increase, and this would be folks who are earning between the current minimum wage here and the new proposed federal standard, would be about 25,000 folks, which is about 8% to 9% of the workforce. So it actually would have a smaller effect here in Alaska than it's going to have in the rest of the country. Predicted job losses in this paper for Alaska, and I apologize for this range, but I think they were trying to be as fair as possible to all the possible assumptions. 1.2% to 13%. Now, if you extrapolate that out, if we do pass the $10.10 federal minimum wage and the ballot measure passes up here, we would have an $11.10 minimum wage. You can extrapolate out from their data, and it would show that you're looking at job losses between 1.6% and 17% here in Alaska. And I will stress that it's not just job losses that you should worry about, but a lot of folks have really stressed the fact that it's the lack of job creation. So you may not see direct unemployment, but you will see a lack of jobs being created. Now, Harding-Kruger were mentioned, and how did I know that Harding-Kruger would be mentioned and made slides for it? Because basically it's famous, because it's an incredibly contrarian paper that went up against basically what the literature had been saying for almost 50 years. Harding-Kruger found that in one particular instance, that an increase in the minimum wage did not result in an increase in unemployment. In fact, they found that the increase in the minimum wage increased employment. Now, Alan Kruger became chairman of the White House Council on Economic Advisors in 2011, and so you would say, oh, wow, fantastic, he must really know his stuff, but I see the causality actually being backwards here. I dare say that Alan Kruger was a popular pick in large part because of the work that he had done in justifying the minimum wage. In 2010, Newmark and Washer actually went back and looked at all the data. Instead of looking at what Harding-Kruger looked at, which were just surveys of business owners, they actually went back and looked at payroll stubs and found that, in fact, the actual job losses amounted to 4% after that increase. Now, the battle between Harding-Kruger, as I mentioned, is ongoing, but it really doesn't matter because the thing is, all of these studies, in order to really get at the effects, all of these studies have to look at short-term effects. because the longer term you look, the more other factors might be influencing what's happening. The problem is that most of the real damage from the minimum wage is going to take place in the long run. In the short run, if you force employers to increase their wages, they have a particular way of doing things. And in the short run, they're just going to have to swallow those increased costs. In the long run, that increased wage that they're being forced to pay is going to get them thinking about alternatives. And those alternatives include labor-reducing technologies, which you're seeing, for example, in fast food restaurants all over Europe where they have high minimum wages. In those places, they no longer have cashiers taking orders. They actually have touch screens doing so. Outsourcing some tasks to overseas workers. And again, it may not be firing necessarily, but not hiring. A lot of the research out there shows that the biggest effects aren't on firing, but are in fact on the lack of job creation that results from an increase in the minimum wage. Now, here's what it comes down to. A lot of economists and people can disagree about this issue, because the fact is the minimum wage will improve the lives of a lot of people. In fact, there's a good chance that it will improve the lives of more people than it will harm. The question is, how do you weigh the costs of unemployment to those who are harmed and the increase in the wage from those who do better? And that's a decision that each one of you has to make yourself. Those are the trade-offs that you have to face. The costs to the individual of unemployment for me are incredibly high. You have the deterioration of skills, which makes it harder. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's harder and harder for you to get a job once you've lost your job. There's a loss of confidence and optimism. There's a deterioration of physical and mental health. Employers oftentimes pass on employees who have suffered long spells of unemployment. So for me personally, the money that's lost by people who've been unemployed isn't really the issue. It's the human cost involved in this unemployment and the inability of our most vulnerable workers to actually be able to get experience in the workforce and move themselves up. The cost to society, I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time, but they're substantial. You'll have to take my word for it. And the problem isn't just unemployment, okay? You know, oftentimes people who say, well, yes, there may be some unemployment, but there's less unemployment because employees are less likely to go looking for other jobs. Well, employees are less likely to go looking for other jobs when they have a high-wage job. Yeah, maybe because they're making a high wage, but they can get that high wage anywhere. The fact is that they're less likely to look for other jobs because those jobs don't exist. And what that means is that decreased job turnover means it's less likely that folks are finding jobs that fit their talents, and it's also more likely that you're going to see firms better able to exploit their workers for fear in those workers if they're going to be unemployed. Henry Ford did not raise the wage to twice the going rate because he wanted people to afford his cars. He raised the wage so that nobody would quit. He desperately wanted to maintain loyalty amongst his workers. You also have potential increased hiring of illegal immigrants, decreased hiring of legal immigrants, which is a huge issue, I think, for Alaska, given that Alaska desperately needs an influx of immigrant labor, to both culturally, I think, and to promote value-based manufacturing, or value-added manufacturing. Increased prices for goods produced by higher labor. This is my favorite. We have this idea. I've got 1 minute left, so I'm going to skip a bunch of important stuff. But this is what I want to stress, okay? We have this idea that the minimum wage is going to help people, and it absolutely is. But someone is going to have to pay that cost for those folks to make more money. Who's going to pay that cost? Well, what we would like is that Walmart and Walmart's shareholders pay that cost, or that the shareholders of McDonald's pay that cost. But that's in fact not what's going to happen. In large part, McDonald's and Walmart are going to attempt to pass on those costs, those extra costs, to their workers, not to their workers, to their consumers, which are oftentimes the people that you're trying to help. Now, I do want to jump ahead real quick and suggest, oh boy, I've got a lot more. Well, obviously, I'm usually doing 75 minutes at a time. 15 is a little tight, okay? But I did want to suggest something. This is a problem that absolutely needs to be solved. And I've got 15 seconds, so I'll stress it. Wage subsidies are the answer. Whether it's the earned income tax credit or it's direct subsidies to employers, these things also raise wages, but do so and increase employment as opposed to actually increasing unemployment. Hopefully, during the question and answer, somebody will give me that question so I can pontificate more broadly on that. But the point is that this is a real problem, and it needs solving, but every solution is not created equal. And the very worst thing about the minimum wage, in my opinion, is the fact that it gives the impression we're actually doing something to help, when there are so many better solutions that are out there.
We'll turn to the direct exchange between the panelists. I think at this point we'd like to ask...
Yeah, can you load mine back up? It's part of the question I want to ask. And have the clicker back. Okay. Now, you bring up the earned income tax credit, and that's a common response from folks that you're using the wrong hammer, you ought to do the earned income tax credit. But who pays for the earned income tax credit? Taxpayers do. And I'd just like you to look at this. When you're basically talking $54 billion for an average benefit under the current system, people talk about we should expand it. An average benefit to the family with children, $29.05 a year. That works out to $1.40 an hour. And single childless people, the maximum is $487 a year. To do anything for these people that's remotely close to a $2 raise in minimum wage, you'd have to double that. Where's another $54 billion going to come from on top of all the subsidies we already provide to these employers to pay their employees health care?
Would it be rude for me to ask a question?
Yeah, that's the question. How do you respond to that?
Okay.
Where's the money going to come from? It's going to come from the taxpayer?
Right, okay, so where's the money going to come from to pay the higher wages to workers with a higher minimum wage?
It's obviously going to come from the employers, and some of that will be passed on to the consumer.
Who oftentimes are the people that you're attempting to help.
They're part of it, sure.
Okay, so you asked who pays the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit is paid out of federal revenues. Federal revenues come from taxes, and taxes are typically in this country paid in large part by the wealthiest members of our society. If you're talking about... well, I didn't know that I would have to bring a slide for that. And I thought that was fairly common knowledge. We have a highly progressive tax system in the United States, correct?
Sure, but
And
it's
so
also
therefore-
gained for the top 1 to 5%. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Okay, that is another debate for sure that we could have about how we close these loopholes. But I would say that in terms, if what you're interested in doing is actually addressing inequality, that if you have one option where you're raising wages, a large portion of the cost of doing so is being passed on to the folks that you're trying to help. And then you have this alternative. The bottom 50% of American taxpayers pay very, very little in the way of federal taxes. In fact, a large portion of them come out net ahead. So the result is that you've got two policies that are aimed at doing the same thing. One of them is paid for primarily by wealthy taxpayers, people who pay federal taxes who tend to be wealthier. And the other, we can't be entirely sure is being paid by those same folks. It's just, if you attempt to, for example, increase the minimum wage, we have this idea that McDonald's, for example, is going to suffer and their shareholders are going to suffer. The fact is, McDonald's is franchised, and those are individual franchise owners. And the average profit margin on a McDonald's franchise is about 2.6%. There's simply no way that they're going to be able to compete with higher wage type restaurants at that profit margin if you
So we should continue to subsidize those franchisees and the corporation with $1.2 billion in public assistance so their workers can subsist?
Well, we have a phrase for this in economics, but it involves a swear word that I don't think would actually pass the FCC muster. Tax incidence or benefit incidence is a pain. It's a real pain. You cannot give money to poor people without Walmart benefiting from it. You can't. You cannot do food stamps without it making it easier for employers to pay their employees less. It can't be done.
Walmart gets 18% of the food.
I agree with you. I think it's grotesque. I think it's wrong. I think it's awful. All those things are true. But anytime you choose to give subsidies to the poor, you're making it easier for the poor to work for less. And as a result of that, you're going to see if you employ poor people, anything that helps poor people makes it so that you have to pay less.
Now, I know this is question time, but I think this is healthy that we're having the back and forth, Taylor. And David Newmark, who you quote, your guy, and I think the more credible of many of the people on the other side. Here's what he said, about EITC, the earned income tax rate. By increasing labor supply, which we all agree is a good thing, making work pay and bringing more people into the labor force, the EITC also lowers wage offers in the low-wage job market. He quote, there may be an argument for coupling the EITC with a higher minimum wage. But to be clear, he holds to his guns. To be clear, the higher minimum wage entails some job loss. But to the notion that just doubling the EITC is going to make everything right is just absurd. It doesn't even come close to a mere $2 increase.
Can I get my gizmo back?
Yeah.
Let me step in here a sec on format. The idea was question, answer.
Yeah, that's pretty stiff.
So, no, and it's been very helpful so far. So Kyle, at this point,
Sure.
we'd like you to pose a question to Ed. You'll have 3 minutes to answer, and then you'll have 3 minutes to explore or challenge his answer. So let's try and hold to that.
Okay.
Kyle, your question, please.
Sure. So you think a $15 minimum wage would increase unemployment?
I think there's definitely a chance as a statewide minimum wage, given our industry mix, that it could. I mean, I am not probably as maybe out as far as some folks are and what might be tried. I think Seattle's probably going to work, because they have a long phase-in. But in this state, we have a lot of low-wage industries, and we probably would just have some of the effects. I don't discount your theories or even Newmark's contentions out of hand, as some on the other side, not necessarily you do with ours. I admit that they have some possibilities, maybe probabilities are higher. The facile comment that people make, well, and I heard this when I was getting signatures, well, if it's such a great idea, why don't we make it $100 an hour? Well, that's ridiculous. There's some point where the job loss impacts are not offset by the greater good. I mean, look at the CBO study, which you touched on. I mean, that was the other side thought that was great, because it showed a potential 500,000 loss of jobs, which is basically 2 months job growth, and we need every job we can get these days in a normal economy. And what we've been posting the last few months, but Goldman Sachs, again, not a tool of the working class. Their response to the right after that study was economists are split on the questions. Goldman Sachs Global Macro Research, March 25th. Economists are split on the question whether minimum wage would hike employment. In our view, the CBO's recent estimate of a 500,000 hit, 0.3%, is likely a bit toward the upper end of reasonable estimates, both because many studies find no significant impact of wage hikes on employment, and because the offsetting boost to demand is likely to be larger than usual at present. Any impact on monthly payroll numbers would likely be small relative to normal volatility and would likely be concentrated in the retail, trade, and hospitality sectors. I mean, that's because, whoever you look at, Economic Policy Institute, David Cooper, John Schmidt, I mean, these are guys that are actually right here. If you want to see meta-analysis that counteracts the laundry list that Dr. Hampton just posted, it basically rebuts a lot of those studies, including Newmark, who again is more credible than a lot of the other ones. But in those studies, it's conceded, and I'm willing to concede that a modest minimum wage increase, which is what we are proposing, $2, it's 13. It's a total of 26% over 2 years with a 2-year phase-in. I think anybody would agree, especially with the cost of living in this state, that qualifies as a modest proposal. And there are ample studies and even some concession by the other side that the job losses are negligible. And of course, our side says probably offset by the increase in economic activity engendered by the better spending power of low-wage workers who spend every dime they've got.
So if Congress chooses to pass a $10.10 federal minimum wage, and the ballot measure passes, that would result in an $11.10 minimum wage.
Eventually, I don't think anybody realistically expects the 10-10 to take effect. I mean, given the current alignment, I don't know when, but I mean, the earliest would be 2018. And yes, if that happened, let's say in mid-2018, the following January 1st, which would be 4 years from now, more than 4 years from now, Alaska would be 11.10. That's right.
And you're comfortable with that?
I'm comfortable with that. Alaska was comfortable, and our economy did pretty damn well with the 50 cents over federal for a long time, and it actually meant something. And this is really just an updating of that concept. If the rest of the country, if Mississippi, if other places, some states that we compete for certain things with, are paying 10.10, Alaska can afford 11.10.
You may be right, actually. The fact is that we are a very high-wage state in a lot of ways, and it's very possible you can set a minimum wage that doesn't have any employment effects. If we were to set a minimum wage at $2, for example, the entire labor market would shrug because there's no job out there now that anybody would necessarily take for $2. It's just not going to drive those jobs out of the market. And it may be that this increase that we're talking about would cause a relatively small increase in unemployment. Possibly. I'm not entirely sure, and these are questions that are difficult to answer for our specific state without having any sort of data. But I come back again to the fact that the biggest issue here for me isn't so much that the minimum wage would cause damage, as it is that we are being damaged by the knowledge that the minimum wage is going to make that significant a difference. For me, the EITC or any sort of wage subsidies that are out there, those actually increase demand for labor or increase demand of laborers to actually work. It costs society the same thing. It's just that the costs aren't hidden in the way that they are with the minimum wage. They're actually being paid by taxpayers, which, as I said, tend to be folks who have more resources and therefore are actually subject to the sort of income redistribution that I think we both want. My biggest fear in supporting something like the minimum wage, and I'm going to reveal a little bit of my cynicism here, it is a midterm election year. And this is what we're getting from the Democratic Party, is this idea for a minimum wage increase. The reason why is because it doesn't require a tax increase, and understanding the cost to society and real human beings is fairly difficult for folks who haven't taken my incredible principles of economics course. And so it's actually a little bit disturbing to me that people who I know, and I know Ed here, I know absolutely deeply feel the need for some sort of economic reform that helps people who are worse off in our society, who are the victims of 30 years of globalization, which is fantastic, but has really done a number on our low-wage workers in this country. It upsets me that this is the solution that we've been given, especially from people who I think know that we can do a lot better.
Okay, well, let me continue my answer because we're in the question time. Just briefly, Taylor, and I have no problem with the way this is going. That's fine. I don't know what the hell the midterm election has to do with it. What people are saying who are promoting this, and we started promoting this, just serendipitously before there was a whole lot of attention on the minimum wage. It was the right time to do it for Alaska because it was 5 years since it had been done, or it will be 5 years. But to say that employers should be paying, and yes, they may pass on the cost, but you have a Walmart Supercenter or a Sam's Club across the street from a Costco that is in direct competition, especially with the Sam's Club, the same industry, and here's one employer paying a living wage, probably doesn't even have any significant reliance for its employees to live on government programs that all the taxpayers pay. Yeah, people that have more pay more, but as a percentage, we all know Warren Buffett's analogy, and I think that makes a lot of sense to a lot of us, that his secretary pays a higher tax rate than he does. I think that's absurd, and that's what people don't want to see. They want to see an end to these subsidies. There's always going to be some subsidies, but for the taxpayer to underwrite, we come at this obviously from completely different directions. For the taxpayer to underwrite the wage bill of the largest employer in the country is ridiculous. When there's top competitors competing head-to-head, making a profit against, in the same industry, but not sucking off the government programs and profiting that way at our expense. I mean, it's there. It's happening. Everybody knows it. Costco, the Wall Street analysts, was super profitable about 5 years ago, but they hated it because it didn't screw its employees as much as it could have. I mean, that was out there. That was published. Well, it's weak management. They pay too much to people, and the CEO only takes $260,000 a year. Hey, that's my kind of company.
Kyle, I want you to treat that as another question. Now it's your opportunity to respond.
Well, I think it should be stressed, actually, that over 50% of employers that actually pay the minimum wage to their employers are firms that are under 50 workers. So we're not talking, it's very easy to demonize.
That's not the case in Alaska. If you had a prototypical actual minimum wage worker, of which there's only 2,500 monthly average, according to the Department of Labor, they ran some numbers, the prototypical is going to be a processor working for a multi-billion-dollar multinational industry out in Dutch Harbor. Because what did they pay out there? When I was commissioner 12 years ago, they used to pay a quarter over minimum wage. I asked a fellow who signed the petition to catch can, said he worked in the processor down there and in the winter went out, for Ballot. And he said, well, what do they pay now? I said, $7.75. I said, really? You've been out there 3 years? He goes, yeah, well, every year they take $5 off my room and board. It used to be illegal for them to charge room and board, but they rammed it through a regulation change in 2003 and basically obviated the effect of the last minimum wage increase by being able to charge these people who have no alternative to their room and board fee. So that's what he gets. That's how they do their business.
So
these are not mom and pops. The mom and pops are the people I met who, in large part are paying more than the minimum wage right now. That's in Alaska. And I need to see, if it's my turn for a question, I need to see some
hang on, let me step in. I think Kyle was trying to get an answer in, didn't get a chance to complete his answer. So let's go back to Kyle, if you had additional framework on this topic, and then we'll move on to the I lost track. Questions?
What's the nature of these workers who are working for $7.75? Where are they from?
I don't think it matters where they're from, but if they're in the seafood industry, I think what you're getting at is probably a very large percentage of them are not Alaska residents. Although out in Dutch Harbor, over the years, that's become, if not a year-round, close to it. A lot of them, probably have more become Alaskans. But at times, the seafood processing, back when we were trying, and the current administration is also launching a new initiative. We try this every few years to Alaskanize, and the CDQ groups have done a good job, obviously. At much higher wages.
Not where I was going. Not where I was going. Right. My guess is a lot of them are immigrants who don't have a whole lot of options for other type of employment. That's who I understand are working in a lot of these different canneries and going fishing.
Would certainly be a big part of it.
You don't think that an $11.10 minimum wage for fish workers would drive, automation of these processes more, basically eliminate a lot of these hand jobs, these hands-on jobs? In favor of automation, possibly even increasing cost efficient that foreign vessels become more profitable for, say, McDonald's in the pollock fishery. You don't see that a $4 increase in the wages of these
I think it would be hard for us to do because that is a very mechanized and automated industry already. Anything that could be done overseas, one of the most fascinating things I ran into when I was commissioner was they were chums, fish was cheap then. Chums were being frozen, shipped to China, having the pin bones removed, probably by prisoners, and refrozen, shipped back, and still sold at a profit. Of course, chums are only 25 or 40 cents a pound.
I would expect to see a lot more of that, actually.
Well, I think it's probably happening as much as it can happen wherever it can happen already. And I don't know that, an increase in the minimum wage, $4 maybe, but it's not, $3.50, $3.35 if they're making $7.75 now. That's right.
We've got a few more minutes that's set aside for the direct exchange between panelists. I think, Ed, one more question, one more exchange initiated by yourself, and then Kyle, one more by you.
Well, I guess I need the timer back and my thing loaded up. Just pushing it up here like we've both been doing about what's a question, what isn't. But I guess I'd just like your reaction since you threw out some numbers by somebody from somewhere else. I'm working with numbers from the Alaska Department of Labor. And some numbers from the Economic Policy Institute too, but here's who's affected. It's screwed up, but we've got the Department of Labor, Alaska Department of Labor, which to me, and I'm prejudiced because I work with these folks, or their predecessors, is the gold standard for numbers. When I get numbers from the Economic Policy Institute, if Alaska Department of Labor has different numbers, I'm going to go with the Alaska Department of Labor. Well, they mentioned, as I said, they ran numbers against the OES Occupational Employment Survey, and I'll get to the question here real quick, just asking for your response to it. Again, they found 2,500 at 775, 875, about 16,500. They found 28,000 workers that would directly get a raise because they make less than 975.
Or be fired.
Economic Policy Institute came up with 20,000 indirect and used a very conservative $1 more. CBO used $11.50 on their 1010 analysis for indirect. So that's 48,000 Alaskans. Maybe some of them are immigrants. Maybe they're not Alaskans yet. Maybe some of them never will be Alaskans. That's potentially 48,000 families. Not teenagers, 20 and over, 78% of them, 57% of them, 25% of them have kids. What do you tell those folks that they're supposed to do? Why they should not support and hope that Alaskans would make a minor improvement in their life by approving a modest increase in the minimum wage. I mean, I don't doubt your humanity at all. I think this is a philosophical thing. Good people of good faith can have opposite opinions, but how do you tell those people they're going to be better off stuck at $7.75?
Well, I wouldn't. You're right. A large number of them, in fact, probably the majority of them would have their lives improved. I'm just saying that those folks who would be harmed by the loss of jobs, whether it's unemployment or jobs that aren't created, that the cost of unemployment is more than simply the lack of wages that that person is earning. That unemployment actually is something far more nefarious for our society, that it tends to actually exacerbate inequality amongst these folks. I understand that a lot of this is trying to address issues of inequality, but you're basically attempting to make some people better off while making some people worse off. The earned income tax credit would actually increase these folks' wages, their take-home wages, while also increasing the opportunities for all of them. That's my issue.
But not to the extent of a $2 raise without a huge expenditure. And the CBO study, which your side sees as on the job loss, but it showed 500,000 maybe. They said between 100,000 and a million. Right. Goldman Sachs said they're estimating high even at 500,000.
Right.
They said 900,000 people would come out of poverty.
That's right.
15.5 million people would get a raise.
That's right.
And they said that maybe under their estimate, 3% of low-wage workers would lose their jobs.
That's true.
Now, you don't think that a material improvement in the lives of 97% against a putative loss of 3% jobs is not a fair trade?
If the minimum wage was the only policy on the table, then I would agree with you, but it's not, and we have an alternative in wage subsidies that would cost our society the same thing as this minimum wage would cost.
They would cost us a lot more.
It would cost taxpayers directly a lot more, but the fact is that we will all pay for the increase in the wages that people earn at these higher wages, whether it's in the form of decreased tax revenues from the business owner, whether it's in the form of increased costs to the food that we're buying. Can I answer this question with some slides myself? Okay, so the issue here is, okay, back up. So the issue here is, exactly who do we want to help? Here are the folks who are actually getting the minimum wage currently. Oh boy, that's not looking too good. Percentage over the age of 24, that should be 51%. 51% of people over the age of 24 actually get the minimum wage. 49% are 24 years and younger. Let's go ahead and talk about this side on the right for the 24 years and younger. 62% of this group live in families with incomes that are at least twice the current poverty level. If you're looking for a policy that directs the cost to society in a way that's really going to improve people's lives, this is a rather scattershot way to do it. Average family income for teens earning the minimum wage is about $70,600. Only about 16.8% of teenagers making the minimum wage in families that fall below the poverty line. Okay, so that's half of the minimum wage is going to teenagers who should probably be in school. The other half over here, 71% of these workers are in families with earnings above the poverty line. So we're not even directly addressing poverty with 71%, actually not 71%, almost 85%. If you count the whole thing. 54% are from families making at least 1.5 times the poverty threshold, 25% work part-time voluntarily, and just 34.3% are full-time workers. We hear a lot about people trying to raise families on a minimum wage, and that is a horrific situation. 4.7% of minimum wage earners are below the poverty line, adults trying to raise a family while working full-time. Now, that's not to say that those 4.7% are not worthy of our assistance. They absolutely are. But a minimum wage is a shotgun approach to actually making that happen when we can have much more directed subsidies to attempt to both improve the wages that they're making and increase the number of employment opportunities that are available to them. The minimum wage, again, you're absolutely right. If it was the only thing that we had at our disposal, then it may very well be worth having some people lose their jobs for other people to have their living standards increased. But when we have this possibility for wage subsidies and the earned income tax credit, it's actually quite frustrating that this is the best that our leaders can come up with.
Now you're concentrating on the minimum wage, which is $2,500 average monthly employment. The number for workers that are making less than $975 is 75% over the age of 20. And in Alaska, the number is 36% under 25. Now, all of a sudden, it used to be that the opponents would say, teenagers, it's all teenagers. Well, guess what? In terms of job destruction, Alaska has had forever, and we don't change it, an exemption from the federal minimum wage for somebody under 18 working 30 hours or less. They're not even covered by the Alaska Wage and Hour Act. They refer to the federal law. But in this case, the current minimum wage, the fact that so few make it shows that it's basically, as was said by one conservative theorist in 1981, we won't repeal it, we'll just let inflation kill it and make it meaningless. Well, that's happened, and that's why we need to raise it. Now, the numbers you raised, the 2012 Alaska real median family income, $80,219. 2/3 of the directly affected would be below that. And that sounds like a lot of money, but you have people working, you might have 3 wage earners, you might have 4 jobs between those 3 wage earners, you have permanent fund dividends. That's a great statistic for you guys to jump on, but Alaskans know that family income, it's not household income, it's family income. We've got big families, we've got multiple wage earners, especially when they're working at the minimum wage, or a little bit above it. And again, 67% under that real family median wage. 80,000. That's the wage, the midpoint, the median. Half of Alaska families make less than that, half make more.
I have to say, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm curious whether the audience actually finds that to be very compelling. To me, there's 2 things that we're trying to do with this increase.
And how many of them are kids that are home in their I'm sorry, Kyle, but how many of them are kids of their parents that can't get the hell out because they're only making $9 or $10 an hour?
Oh, don't even get me started. I mean, we can talk about healthcare reform, which is one reason why we've seen stagnating wages amongst the middle class. I mean, there's so many different issues here that we could be addressing instead of this symbolic gesture of actually increasing the minimum wage. You say 80,000. For me personally, if what we're interested in doing is actually addressing real problems of poverty, like I said, we need policies that address poverty and don't necessarily increase the wages of folks who are going to be better off anyway. One thing that I didn't mention here is that one reaction to increased wages by law is that you're going to see more internships, zero-paying internships. If you have this sort of increase. And the only folks who can actually afford to work for free tend to be folks whose parents are very wealthy, and that's just going to further exacerbate inequality when the only people who can take these sorts of jobs necessary to get experience are willing to work for zero.
Well, you're predicting a problem that's already rampant.
Absolutely.
It couldn't get any worse than it is.
I think it can certainly possibly get worse.
Kyle, in theory, you have a chance to pose a question to Ed. Change the chapter in a few minutes and turn to audience questions. I'm going to do my best to keep this going.
You said your data, you have data from the Economic Policy Institute.
Yes.
And they receive money from the AFL-CIO?
I know they receive a lot of money from unions,
Yeah.
probably from the AFL-CIO.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you mentioned earlier that the AFL-CIO has supported your organization essentially on principle.
Yes.
Okay. Because union workers typically make well above the minimum wage.
In Alaska,
Yeah.
especially, yes. We only have a couple of unions in our industries that are low wage, in the grocery or in the restaurant business.
Now, the competition for union workers, well-trained, incredibly well-trained union workers who probably have access to better equipment, presumably would be lower-skilled workers with less access to good equipment. So, for instance, you could have 20 folks with shovels dig a hole, or you could have one person with a bulldozer dig a hole, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so
in the same hole.
Well, yeah, sure. But if theoretically you could
That's
raise,
very theoretical.
if you could raise the cost of those 20 workers digging that hole, presumably that would drive up the wages of the union workers.
That's a really lame analogy. I
will let the audience
I don't think it
determine
works.
whether how lame that was. Yeah, no, I'm sorry to be a little bit cynical here about the aims of the AFL-CIO and their sovereignty, their allegiance to their brothers in arms. But I do believe that the labor unions have a significant motivation, just like, I'm sure, like you mentioned earlier, the opponents of your policy almost certainly are, I mean, Yeah, scumbags, everyone. The lobbying organizations for the Restaurant Owners Association, all of them are going to be making lots of emotional appeals that are essentially based entirely on their self-interest. If that's the kind of arguments that we're making against our opponents, I think it's fair, turnabout is fair play. Do you think so?
Well, I've got a lot of experience in the labor movement with the AFL-CIO, and like any group, have members to represent, but this is a case where they are looking to, maybe it's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. Sure, there might be some of that, but, there is a basic public service, human decency element to the labor movement. You might not pencil out, it might not show up, it might not make economic sense, but it's goddamn there, Kyle. And I've seen it. And that's why we put this thing out there, where there's going to be no gain for them, but it's going to help workers. And that's what they do. And it's kind of a creed. And if you can't get your head around that, then, there's probably things I can't understand that you hold dear.
Quick comment, then we're going to turn to the audience, okay?
Yeah, honestly, I don't work for any sort of lobbying organization or anything like that. When I came to start studying economics, and I came to realize that the minimum wage is actually hurting people, I was blown away. And I'm sure a lot of you were probably blown away to hear it. Some of you were probably pretty angry to hear it. But it was a gestalt switch for me. It really was. And it made me love economics because it made me see that good intentions aren't good enough, that simply hoping that you can reverse the laws of economics by virtue of putting up a wall, by virtue of passing a law that says that we have to pay people more than what they're being paid, that's not going to have some sort of unforeseen consequences. The economic system is an ecological system, and we all know that when you attempt to manipulate these ecological systems, oftentimes you get these unforeseen consequences that may actually be the opposite of what you want. I hope that you trust me when I say that I want the same thing that you do. And I do not think that this particular policy is the right policy for helping to address these issues of poverty, real poverty, and inequality. And actually, what bothers me most about it is that it's essentially a red herring that's distracting us from better solutions that are out there.
Well, I got to place some faith in the collective wisdom of Alaskans, of Americans in general. And, for 75 years or more, this has been the law of the land. You tell the people that are going to benefit from this that they're better off without a $2 raise for 2 years. Good luck. You tell their neighbors, the people who are going to vote to pass this thing, probably by 2-to-1 margin. I hope it's by 2-to-1 margin so that the legislature will keep its meat hooks off it 2 years from now when they can come back at the behest of certain industries and repeal the cost of living index. And those folks, we're not stupid. We know what's going on. You can bring out your theories and tell us that, oh, you're really not doing what you think you're doing. Well, I don't see anything. I've looked at earned income tax credit. Yeah, it's a great program. It brings people out of poverty. Republican idea. Progressives like to do it because they can say they're doing something Ronald Reagan did. But it's not the answer. It's already there. In this environment, there's not going to be more money or expansion of the EITC. Not at the cost that the commensurate benefit from a minimum wage increase is it's not even close.
Let me thank you both for spirited debate thus far. Please take a second, take a drink of water. Now we're going to have some really hard questions from the audience. So this question, I will read two related questions having to do with the social safety net. And I think what I'd like to do is to ask Ed to answer first. And our timing on questions from the moderator was 3-minute responses, more or less. Ed first and then Kyle. So will an increased minimum wage push typical minimum wage families over the threshold for programs like WIC, Section 8 housing, Medicaid, etc.? And please comment on the costs to society for those who don't make enough income and have to rely on food stamps and other governmental programs in order to survive. So the relationship of the social safety net to minimum wage.
Can I swing her back and load mine back up? Okay. Yeah, it varies on the program. And one of the neat things about EITC is that it always pays to make another dollar. It's not a dollar for dollar loss. It's not a cliff that you fall off of. Food stamps, well, that program's under challenges. I believe there's a sliding scale there too. So for the most part, now with Medicaid was one where it was an issue, but I think now with Affordable Care Act, that is less of a problem. So I think to the first part of the question, it's not an issue. Now, what was the second part about subsidies?
Please comment on the costs to society for those who don't make enough income and have to rely on food stamps and other governmental programs in order to survive.
Okay, well, here, thank you very much for that question, because I haven't gotten to this slide. We all subsidize employers of low-wage workers. Here's what it looks like. Walmart employees, $6.2 billion. Medicaid and CHIP, earned income tax credit, food stamps. I couldn't find a breakdown on that. And that is from Americans for Tax Fairness. Public assistance for fast food workers from the UC Berkeley Labor Center. About $7 billion. $3.9 billion in Medicaid and CHIP. That's the Denali Kid Care here in Alaska. It's a child health improvement, I think, plan. $1.04 billion in earned income tax credit. $1.91 billion in food stamps. McDonald's is 1.2 of that $7 billion. 52% of the families of frontline fast food workers are enrolled in one or more public assistance programs versus 25% of the workforce as a whole. I think that answers the question.
Kyle, do you want to take a turn?
So increasing the minimum wage solves this problem now.
Because there will be some reduction in those benefits. Again, not on a dollar for dollar basis, but you would see reductions in the earned income tax credit as some people made more money and had less dependence on it. Now, they might be at the plateau point of it, and not get out of that, but they probably would if they're at $9.75. Food stamps would be reduced. And what if we only saved $1 billion of that and diverted it to the Highway Trust Fund, where that creates 13,000 construction-related jobs? And this is just one, granted, the largest employer in the country with 1.3 million employees and one large industry. But that's only part of it. The $54 billion is just the cost for the earned income tax credit. Again, a great program, but if we can reduce dependence on that through employers paying at least a better share of the subsistence needs of their workers than the taxpayer, I think that's a good thing.
Kyle, additional comments on this question?
No, honestly, all the things that you're saying, the results from that increase in the earned income tax credit would be the same, obviously, except for the fact that the earned income tax credit costs would go up. But of course, there are costs involved in reducing these costs as well. If you increase the minimum wage, you increase the price of food, you increase the cost to small business owners, you also drive some people out of the workforce, which they're not able to pay any taxes at all and require more of this sort of assistance. So again, I agree with everything that you're saying. This is an anathema. It's absolutely terrible, but I'm not sure, again, that the minimum wage is the way to solve this problem. In fact, in many ways, I think it exacerbates the problem by increasing the incidence of poverty, by increasing the incidence of unemployment.
We're going to turn to another question. Thank you. And this time I'll ask Kyle for you to respond first, followed by Ed. The question is this: would more widespread unionization, including unskilled jobs in retail restaurant trades, be a more effective response to low wages than a legislatively induced minimum wage? Kyle, your thoughts first, and then we'll turn to Ed.
Italy, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. None of these countries would ever be considered a place where workers are not very well taken care of. None of these countries have a minimum wage. What they do have are laws that promote collective bargaining within industries. And so I would say that there are certain things that can be done to improve the bargaining position of workers. That would be a far better solution for increasing wages than well-paid workers with minimum wage.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree. If we hadn't vitiated our labor law over the last 33 years primarily, it might be a different story. But when we had stronger unions, a stronger labor law, and a more effective right to organize, raising the minimum wage was barely even a controversial issue. It was a bipartisan agreement, just that, hey, it's time to raise it. It's only become a political football, maybe coincidentally, since 1981, with the decline in unions, and has lost so much ground to be almost meaningless.
Thanks. Let's keep moving. Questions from the audience. This time we'll start with Ed, turn to Kyle second. Data from the Alaska Judicial Council shows a big correlation between poverty and minor crime, especially theft. Would minor crime be reduced if more people had a living wage?
I go first?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I haven't really studied that issue. I mean, folks come to the minimum wage cause, from different venues, and I really haven't looked at any literature with that, so I wouldn't want to just, talk through my hat here. But it seems like if, hopefully if folks are better provided for, there'd be at least some reduction in crime, it wasn't pathological behavior, it was driven by absolute need or desperation. But I really, don't have any firm, thoughts to offer on that.
High wages definitely are correlated with a decrease in crime, absolutely, but an even greater correlate with decreased crime is increased employment. And in fact, there's a significant improvement once you start improving the employment level at any wage level in the reduction of crime. And so that would be one of my big arguments for not attempting a policy that could increase unemployment.
Okay. Let's see, this question will start with Kyle and turn to Ed second. The present minimum wage has been in effect for quite a while. We also have had small annual inflation of 2 or 3%. This cumulatively erodes the purchasing power of the minimum wage. It all adds up. What's the best way to fix this? P.S. My wage on the first job was 55 cents an hour.
Who are you? Probably think, yeah.
I did pretty good for a while. See the person. This is for me first?
You first. So this had to do with the erosion over time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The minimum wage is, if you look at the minimum wage in real terms, it's this buzzsaw. There's an improvement, and then it decreases in value, and then an improvement, and then decreases in value. So, absolutely, you've definitely seen a decrease in the buying power of the minimum wage. Again, I must stress, I am all for increasing the wages of low-earning, low-skilled, or blue-collar workers within our society. But minimum wage is not going to do that without unemployment, whereas wage subsidies would. And so if that is your primary concern, is the eroding purchasing power, I think improving that purchasing power can be done through other means.
Yeah.
Well, minimum wage, as Kyle really mentioned, it puts a floor under the wage system. The market still works. I mean, our minimum wage is dysfunctional in many areas of Alaska, so you have a de facto or functional minimum wage that's higher. It's less than $9.75 in most places. Not all, certainly not in rural Alaska. I had a representative out there during the legislative debate say, hell, I'm voting against this because it's, I don't like what they're trying to do. He says, but out in Bethel, the box boy makes $15 an hour. So it only makes sense. But yeah, it gets eroded by inflation. It's certainly happened here. You hear a lot of reference to 1968, and 1010 is an attempt to get close. I think the 1968 minimum wage, that's when I started working, $1.60 an hour. You could get 5 gallons of gas in New York for $1.60. You could probably get 3 gallons of milk. Milk and gas weren't the same price then.
But what kind of mileage are you getting?
But, not getting much better now in my Ford pickup, but that's my fault. But you could get an apartment for, a decent apartment. It wasn't fancy. It was in a, semi-safe neighborhood studio apartment before we called them efficiencies for $80 or $90 a month for 60 hours of minimum wage. HUD now, $11.46, fair market value, 2-bedroom apartment. How many hours at $7.75 do you have to work to get that? To even come close to meeting 30-cent housing. But employment is a big part of it. Kyle's right. I don't disagree. But they talk about. Here's what happened. This is again Goldman Sachs first did an analysis of December and then January, looking at the states, 13 of which raised the minimum wage. Some because they do it every year because they do inflation proofing like we should do, like we had in the law, but it was repealed before it ever got to take effect. And if you look, the 13 states, only one of them had job loss, Jersey. They all had more significant job growth than as a whole. Well, they looked at 1 month, and then the Center for Economic Policy Research looked at the last 5 months of last year, the first 5 months of this year. And again, it's early days, but if everything Kyle's saying is true, you should have seen less employment growth. The employment growth in the 37 states that did not increased their minimum wage was 0.61%. It was 0.85% in the 13 states that did. Washington State, the highest minimum wage for the last 15 years, has, not quite as high as California, but damn near the highest job growth. Nevada, of course, they're just, they're in the phase where they're finally coming out of the recession. But Washington is a good case in point for a strong, one of the first to do a CPI minimum wage that has had tremendous job growth compared to the rest of the country, even relatively speaking, through the recession, with the highest minimum wage in the country and a valid cost of living adjustment.
Thank you. Here's another question, and I think this time we'll start with you and turn to Kyle second. How will the minimum wage increase affect retired people? So side effects on retired people.
Well, the ones that are having to work low-wage jobs to get by will certainly benefit. Other than that, we didn't see great price increases. Kyle will say that they're going to be hurt by inflation, but again, Goldman Sachs predicts even at the 10-10, were that to come to pass on the federal level, a 0.1% inflation attributable to that increase. I don't know that there'd be much effect, but the many that are still required to work to supplement their pensions, if they're lucky to have them, more probably living just on Social Security if they have to be out taking low-wage work. They're going to benefit tremendously from an increase, or if they're over 975 from the spillover or trickle-up effect that is well documented for the indirect effect.
Kyle, your thoughts on effects on retired people?
You totally got me. Yes, I was definitely going to say that. You're absolutely right. There will be very little effect on inflation from a minimum wage, which is, again, trapped here. This is a semester's worth of macroeconomics. Inflation is at all times a monetary phenomenon, but whatever. The fact is that you will see targeted inflation in certain sectors. I'm not going to keep going back, but I do have a slide about research on food prices and restaurant food prices and their increase as a result of increases in the minimum wage. There are significant sector increases, especially with food, that I think are going to affect people that are on that don't necessarily have a steady income that's coming in. So on that, I think we would have to respectfully disagree. As far as food prices going up, especially in service industries, the retirees could see an increase in costs here in Alaska.
Okay. Next question. Estimates for a living wage in Alaska are as high as $21 an hour, largely due to high costs for consumer goods. Given that the wage increase proposed doesn't even cover the living wage before the likely increase in prices, how does the wage increase justify the potential loss of jobs? And I think Kyle will go to you first.
It doesn't. It's $21 is
living wage. So talk to me about living wage versus minimum wage strategies.
It's essentially, it's just a matter of language. It's like depression, recession, tomato. It's marketing mostly. The idea of a living wage is that somebody figured out somewhere that this is what would be necessary to survive on. But it does allow me to mention one thing that I didn't mention before, and that is, Seattle's going to try this $15 minimum wage. They're going to try it, and I could not be more excited that it's not happening here. And I couldn't be more excited that it's happening, period. I'm very happy that it's happening because I think we need experiments. We need policy experiments, and I'm very curious to see what happens in those places. My guess is that maybe you don't see a huge decrease in employment, in large part because the wage there is already pretty high. But what you will see over time is a change in the cultural fabric of that city. It will drive immigrants out of the city for the most part. That has been a huge part of creating the culture of that city. It will drive immigrants' businesses out of those places. And you will essentially, what I'm predicting, and you can all check my prediction 20 years from now, but what I'm predicting is that you will have a core in the middle, which are very well-heeled, well-compensated Seattleites buying very expensive coffee and meals. And then all the hard work will be done in a large ring outside the city, especially the immigrants that are out there. When I moved up here, my first thought when I got here was, my gosh, especially having visited Canada, whatever we can do in this community, in this state, to encourage more immigration. We're a wonderfully diverse community already. I think 70 languages spoken in the Anchorage School District. 100 languages spoken. And that was one of the things that really appealed to me when I moved up here. But the folks who tend to be hurt by these sorts of policies, these minimum wage policies, are the folks who are the most vulnerable, who are willing to work for the least. And we may look at what they're working for and the wages that they're earning and say, I'm very uncomfortable with the fact that they're not making more. But mandating that they make more doesn't always result. In fact, oftentimes does not result in them making more. In fact, results in them making nothing and making it very impossible for them to be able to find the jobs here that would help us to have that sort of diverse community.
Well, I don't know that 15 is even a living wage in Seattle. It probably isn't. And you're right, the de facto minimum wage there is probably $12 bucks. But I totally disagree. I mean, it's fascinating to take that airlink, from SeaTac up to Seattle, and you go through almost 4 or 5 different cultures. I mean, it's amazing. And all I see with those folks, King County, Seattle, if they're in the $15, I think they are, they would be affected, is better standard of living for those folks, more customers with money in their pocket for those immigrant businesses. I mean, I think, and the fascinating thing about Seattle is that it was really a negotiated settlement. I mean, there's a suit from the franchise industry, but the restaurant owners, some of them, one of the larger restaurant owners, started paying his people $15 already. Now, he was on an outlier, and with tipped employees, no tip credit there like here. Which I think, even though 43 states have it, is an abomination that you can pay waiters and waitresses in most states as little as $2.13 an hour, and then they're good luck. You got to get the rest from the customers. But Seattle, they phased it in. They phased it in longer for the restaurant industry, and the city, has a right to decide that, hey, we want to try this social experiment, and I'm really curious to see it. I mean, I don't make any pretense that what we're doing is a living wage. I don't buy the part, if I heard part of that question, how do you justify the unemployment? Because, I won't pull the slide up again, but been there, done that, in Alaska, 27%, New Year's Eve, when the ball fell, 3 hours later or whatever in New York, Alaskan minimum wage was $5.65, and 2 minutes later, 1 second later, it was $7.15. And the low-wage industries, wages were up, and jobs were up. A lot of other factors operated. And look at 2004, though. I have the 2004 numbers. I didn't have a slide for them. Continued growth in both employment and in wages. Actually, processors, these food processors, in 2004, the employment went up, average monthly wage was down $114 a month. Maybe there's less effort or something like that, but the number of jobs was up. So we've been there and done that. I mean, quantity of jobs up, quality of jobs in terms of pay up. I think most Alaskans will take that deal.
Can I address that? Sure. Can you skip a couple of slides forward?
Here you go.
Oh, thanks. In May 2014, Northwest Asian Weekly spoke to some hospitality workers in SeaTac after the imposition of the minimum wage. And this was the exchange. Are you happy with the $15 wage? It sounds good, but it's not good. Why? I lost my 401k, my health insurance, my paid holiday and vacation, and no more free food. The hotel used to feed her, now she has to bring her own food, no overtime. Also, what else? I have to pay for parking. And the reason why I bring this up is because one thing that I want to stress, I know I've been harping a lot on unemployment, and I think unemployment is a big deal and has serious harms to society. But even when you don't have unemployment, an increase in these wages, again, it's like the wave hitting the wall. That force doesn't just disappear. It manifests itself in different ways. It manifests itself in a decrease in the treatment of workers because those workers are basically afraid to lose that $15 job because essentially there's a line of folks who are willing to take it, willing to work for less. These economic forces don't disappear. They just manifest themselves in ways that you may not always expect. And so if you do impose these sorts of minimum wage, maybe you don't get so much unemployment, but you do give your employers a lot more leeway to push around their workers, and that's one more cost that has to be counted.
Well, Kyle, we're going back and forth a little bit here. Just give me a minute. Like many advocates from the other side, you key on unemployment, and unemployment at any wage is better than none. Well, we have, as you conceded, we have a terrible problem of people working their butts off for totally inadequate wages. And if we drive more people into that employment, it's a good thing they're going to work. But if we're driving them into a broken system already of impecunious employment and inadequate wage and subsidy, all we're doing is supersizing, so to speak, the problem that we have. I mean, you've got to address the problem, the system, the employment world that you want these people to get into. It can't just be the law of the jungle. We've got to put a floor. Right now it's a goddamn sub-basement, but we've got to put a floor under the market, under the wage system. Market's still going to operate, but we're going to say, here's where you don't go any lower. Now, 15, I mean, that's one story. There's probably a lot of other stories there. SeaTac was real interesting. One of the most popular eateries in SeaTac was one of the prime did commercials for that. He said, hey, when these guys, and we know what precipitated that, family wage jobs for baggage handlers were thousands of them, or hundreds of them, maybe, were contracted out. Went from 15 to $8 or $9 overnight. And he said, guess what? I got nobody coming in my bar and restaurant, because they can't afford it. So yeah, he supported a $15 minimum wage. One of the leading small businessmen in SeaTac. That's it.
We're going to turn to another topic. Thanks. This is, given the extreme unlikelihood that tax-based solutions like the EITC, particularly in an election year, would be implemented, could an increase in minimum wage be expected in any way to act as a substitute mechanism for wealth distribution? So it's on the political landscape and the likelihood of a tax-based solution as opposed to minimum wage. And I forgot who was next. Let me look. Ed, first, please.
Okay, now if the question is it a possible solution, I don't know that there are any political solutions in the current environment, whether it's minimum wage or an increase in the EITC. And we probably should have both. But where are we going to get more money? In the case of the EITC, it's tax money. It's probably going to come from food stamps, which a lot of people want to cut. Oh, it's terrible, food stamp use is up. Well, we just came off the worst recession in 80 years, 75 years. Of course there's more people on food stamps, We get them on jobs, which is starting to happen, and the food stamps will go down. But I'm afraid if EITC was increased, it would be at the expense of other programs. Because it is the one that conservatives love, because Uncle Ron invented it, or something.
Or because
It works.
it saves people's lives.
Yeah, bring 6.5 million people out of poverty. No argument there.
Yeah.
But it ain't cheap.
Let me talk about this, because one of the things that the president and a lot of folks on the left have been pushing is the idea that the EITC and the minimum wage are actually complements. That there's no reason that they would be mutually exclusive. And that's actually, I think, false. Take this example. We've got this wage here, and the wage is currently $8, all right? And as you can see, at this wage, we've got more employees than we've got employers. Now, if you were to subsidize employers, $2 per hour, $2 per worker, however you want to think about it, if you were to actually subsidize them for every American worker that they hired instead of a machine or a foreign worker, what that would do is it would have the effect of increasing the number of employers that wanted to actually employ folks. And the result of that would drive up the wage. Now, am I done? Okay, so I'm done. Here's the situation. Forget that crap. Here's the situation. If you have a minimum wage, and because of the minimum wage, you actually have a gap between the number of jobs and the number of people who want that job, the EITC makes jobs more appealing. Does everybody understand that? You only get the earned income tax credit if you're working. And so what that means is that the more of the EITC, the bigger the EITC actually is, the more workers are going to want to work. And if you have a minimum wage that's causing a gap, causing that unemployment, you're going to exacerbate that unemployment by encouraging more workers to try to enter the workforce. Because, frankly, that's the idea, is that if you have this, and again, this goes back to these subsidies for food stamps and all of these other things. You can't control, when you give people money, where that money ends up. You give money to folks in the form of food stamps, of course that's going to decrease the amount of work, or what they have to be paid in order to work. And the result of that is that it drives down, you could make the argument that food stamps and the EITC and all of these things are driving down wages. They absolutely are. They make it possible for workers to work for cheaper.
Which is why David Newmar, who you quote extensively, whose work you cite, in the quote I mentioned earlier, said that it should be in tandem with the minimum wage increase, that it was justified because of that lowering effective wages exactly the fact you're talking about. So,
so the EITC
our
is
proposal, at $9.75, 2080, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year worker, family of 3, because that's what the poverty rate for that's around 24,000. They make 20,280. Under the EITC, they hit the plateau point, because you go up as you earn more, Kyle Owens, and then $3,250 a year they get from the level of $8,000 a year until around a little more than what was until about $23,000, and then they start the gradual decline all the way down to $44,000. So I don't see how you can say they don't work well together. I mean, it does extend that curve out some, but it's to say that the EITC would be the be-all and end-all without a minimum wage. It's going to exactly what you just said happen. It's going to drive wages down further.
Let's move to another question. Do the states with higher minimum wages than Alaska also subsidize food, energy, housing, and transportation and medical care to the extent that Alaska does? And will the increase in minimum wage take Alaskans off of the generous handouts that the state gives? I'm reading these.
Well, you have to name, is it me first or Kyle this time?
Let's go with you.
Okay.
You already started.
You'd have to name all those programs, but Alaska does the minimum possible, certainly in the case of healthcare, with the refusal of the governor to do the Medicaid expansion. Virtually all the programs where we give money away, not all of them, but most of them are federal programs that are the same across the states. So I think it's fairly safe to say, and I could be wrong, but that in most cases, in most programs, we are stingier than other states. So I think the whole question is kind of specious.
Okay, Kyle, your thoughts?
Well, I know that a lot of these policies, and I'm a new Chichaco, only 4 years here, but I do know that a lot of these policies that subsidize living in Alaska are for rural residents. And I don't want to mischaracterize what you said, but the minimum wage that we're talking about here would probably do nothing to help rural Alaskans, right?
It wouldn't in most of the communities out there, like I said, nobody's working for $7.75. But there is a connection that a lot of folks from there, Anchorage is the biggest native village in Alaska. Fairbanks is second biggest. And so folks from those families certainly come into, and we actually start to have a lot of folks out in that too.
Send money back.
They send money back.
Okay.
And they are in the low wage economy, many of them, not all of them, certainly. I mean, there's people
I hadn't thought about
come here that are working out now, Kamiko and stuff. But
yeah, that's a great point. But as for those folks who do live in rural Alaska, the minimum wage isn't really going to do much to raise them. Those of them who actually have jobs, and that's one of the things that's kind of frustrating is that, when I'm looking at the real problems that minimum wage is supposed to solve, I see most of those problems in rural Alaska. But one number that I didn't actually get to bring up is the fact that nationwide, 70% of folks under the poverty line are not working at all, and so would not be helped by any sort of increase in the minimum wage. And these folks in rural Alaska who are not being helped by the minimum wage, I would like to think, actually, would still be helped by these policies that are directed at rural poverty directly.
Kyle, there's plenty of folks in Anchorage and Fairbanks and other areas of the state, and communities right in neighborhoods right in Anchorage that are I'll tell you, they're in as desperate straits as anybody in rural Alaska, and they would benefit from it.
I have no doubt about that.
How many people will lose their jobs when small businesses can't afford to pay more? They will have to cut employees. Kyle, I think this comes back to a topic we've touched, but if you wouldn't mind, please summarize your thoughts on that.
Yeah, real quickly, over half of, and again, it's very difficult to find Alaska-specific statistics when it comes to this sort of thing, but over half of the minimum wage jobs that are out there are with firms that are less than 50 employers, and a lot of those tend to be fast food restaurants or ethnic restaurants here in town, and the profit margins for those businesses are extremely low. They would have to look into some sort of automation or possibly even cutting workers and asking workers to work harder if they are forced to pay that higher wage.
I just keep coming back to, I hate to be a live horse in my opinion, the example of what happened in 2002, 2003, of the dire effects that Kyle predicts and projects from theory and from extrapolating possibly situations in other states had happened in Alaska. Folks would have known about it in 2003. The folks who, tried vehemently to oppose and stifle the law would have been back, making the case that things were terrible, and it did not happen.
Can I go a second? Sure. So as we said, the minimum wage gets increased, and then its value decreases, presumably, right?
With
inflation?
Absolutely.
Okay,
sure.
So in Alaskan history, at these times when inflation has decreased the value of the wages being earned by Alaskans, what's happened to employment?
Employment, at least for the last 20 years, has been, fairly steady. 1-2% growth. Less than 2% is a lot. I mean, it's 1.5 is probably the average. And I could be wrong, I'm a little out of date, but that was our consistent. I mean, we had 22 after our big. We had our 2008, 1986 here.
My house was built then.
Yeah.
It's held together with chewing gum and Ballot.
Yeah, well, somebody, there's a good chance a lot of houses in that year, the bank got them when people drove by and threw the keys at the And my house in Fairbanks is one of those,
Yeah.
And, but, we've been through our big shake.
Right.
And that's why we didn't have the big problem. But generally, that was a period when the minimum wage was the 80s. During the entire Reagan administration, there was no federal increase unless there was no Alaskan increase. But, in terms of what it's worth, like I started to say before, and I got off track, in 68, you hear a lot about that, that the $1.60 in 1968 would be 10-something. Well, Alaska was $2.10 because of our 50 cents over. If you just go to the Department of Labor and plug in $2.10 in 1968, you put that into 2014 dollars, it's like $12.20 or $12.30. That's what it would be at. So getting back to the inflation erosion, I don't know, it's just the way it is.
The reason why I bring it up is because a lot of you keep showing this fact that we had these increases in the minimum wage and nothing bad seemed to happen. But all of the research that I'm showing and most of the research that we do in economics, the fact is there's a lot of different things happening at once, and you have to control for all of those factors. The fact is that job growth and economic growth in Alaska has been pretty strong. And assuming that you said 12, how much do you think it was worth? About $12?
$2.10 in 1968 would be worth over $12.
My guess is in 1968, $12 was what it took to get people to move up here. And therefore, you wouldn't expect a minimum wage of that amount to actually be very binding. And my guess is that minimum wage didn't really raise too many incomes at that time because so many people were already making a wage that was either that or in excess. Am I mischaracterizing?
Well, I think taking $12 back there, I don't follow that. I mean, $2.10 was a lot, was a lot more than it is today.
But what percentage of workers at that time, in Alaskan workers in 1968, were actually making that $2.10?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Here's a question for Dr. Hamilton. Could you expand on Dr. Hampton?
All right.
Excuse me. I went to college in Hamilton.
See?
Freudian slip. Can you expand on and explain the connection, if any, between minimum wage and the cost of living? At what point does there need to be an increase in minimum wage? What is the maximum disparity between minimum wage and cost of living possible? Is there ever a point at which the minimum wage should be increased, and when?
Well, if it's not entirely obvious, I would do away with all minimum wages right off the bat. I know that's not a popular idea. I think that most people, the first thought when you start talking about eliminating the minimum wage is that people would pay 25 cents an hour and that the workers would be exploited. The fact of the matter is, how many workers in Alaska make the minimum wage currently?
2,500 on an average annual monthly.
Percentage-wise of the workforce?
Less than 1%.
Right. So the fact is, for 99% of workers, no minimum wage is necessary. Correct?
For not 99%, but probably 40,000, 7 or 8%, there's not a functional minimum wage.
Right.
There should be.
Okay.
And that's what we're doing. We're trying to establish a meaningful minimum wage.
I honestly think for most, for all jobs, that the price that emerges in this market, if the price that would emerge in a market without the minimum wage is $7 for a particular worker, then if you apply an $11.10 minimum wage, I'm pretty sure that job is no longer going to exist. The problem is this. Look, we're upset that workers are making $7. You're upset. I'm upset about that. Absolutely. I mean, it's an anathema. But the problem is that there are people in this world who can only produce $7.25 worth of value. I have a good friend, a hardcore Marxist labor economist, and she told me that she actually supports the minimum wage because it creates unemployment. Because it creates unemployment, it actually takes those people who are the least productive in society, who aren't able to warrant the $11 minimum wage, and actually drives them into public services where they can improve their productivity. I don't know if you're comfortable with that argument, but that is the argument that she's made. I think it's kind of cool, actually. But that's our problem, is that there are people who are making $7 and don't have the ability to negotiate the higher salaries above minimum wage that 99% of workers are.
So those people should go get training to improve their value. But how are they going to get it when they're only making $7 an hour and having to work 60 hours at 2 fast food joints?
You name it. Tell me a policy proposal where the federal government...
They are potentially worth more than that.
Absolutely.
And they're stifled and they're stymied by what the economic drudgery that they're causing. And because we have a non-functional minimum wage.
So we'd like to provide one last opportunity for closing comments from the panelists. So 3 minutes to reiterate key points, to summarize some of the recent discussion. Ed, would you go first? So 3 minutes.
No, I went first on the opening comment first. That's standard procedure.
Here we go. Kyle.
I know I didn't convince most of you. I understand that. Like I said, part of the reason why I became an economist was because when I saw these sorts of dynamics, when I came to understand the things that seemed so clearly to help people, so obviously to help people, actually in many cases made things worse and kept us from pursuing policies that could actually improve people's lives, I was blown away. And I really did feel like I had to tell everyone about it. And I do every semester. Take my class, please. You have to understand that I think that everything that everybody who's here tonight wants is what I want too. I can't speak for the Restaurant Owners Association. I'm sure they're very cynical about this, and there will be people who will oppose this measure, who will do so on entirely selfish grounds, but I think that's true of the union support of the other side as well. But the fact is that I truly do believe that there are things that we can do that will make people better off, that will actually direct our efforts towards the poverty that we're all concerned about and the inequality that we're all concerned about, without this scattershot approach that can oftentimes make our most vulnerable worse off. I want the same things that you guys want. I know I come at it from a very bizarro economics world, but I believe this, and I hope that in some small way I've helped you to understand a little bit better where people on the other side are coming from.
Well, thank you. And Kyle, I think you certainly have achieved that. I'll never agree with you. You advanced the arguments, I think, with a lot more eloquence and with at least some obvious compassion than I see from a lot of the folks you quoted up here. But I mean, we're a nation, we're a state, we're a society of laws. And Kyle probably, and that was going to be one of my questions, I never got to it. He probably has an issue as a free market economist on child labor. I mean, if somebody wants to pay a 12-year-old to do something, they'll do it. I don't know. Do you have? I should just attribute that to you. Do you have any opinion on child labor?
Is there a Fifth Amendment that I can cite in this case?
Anyway, and this is nothing different. I mean, it's been since 1938, and again, let's remember when minimum wage happened. We came back from we were coming back from something even worse than the economic horrors that we've experienced and been more spared from, thankfully, in Alaska than the rest of the country. But I mean, in the 1930s, demand collapsed, and one of the solutions, which had popular support and continues popular support, was that it's okay for government to set a floor, to set some minimum value. It was very minimal when it started. I mean, 25 cents in 1938, I think, only equates to about $3.50 now. You know, we talk about 1968 as the high point. Well, of course, if you're starting a minimum wage program, you're going to start low. And then you get to where it's meaningful. But, I mean, this is, to me, and I think to a lot of people, a basic, it's economic, but it's also justice. It's also fairness. It's also basic humanity. Time out of people's lives and the payment for, you know, what is essential to all of us, work, has to provide some modicum of decent subsistence. I mean, the old dismal economists, you know, had the iron law of wages, which was true for a long time until unions came and until we had some social programs, whether they were good intended or just to avoid unions or socialism, stealing the socialist thunder in Bismarck's terms. But, you know, put in these social protection programs to make sure that people at least get more than basic subsistence. And now, you know, they're not even getting paid by their employer in many industries even the basic amount that they need to subsist. We're paying that as taxpayers. And I think a lot of us would rather, you know, we can cast our, if I remember my microeconomics, we cast our dollar ballots in the economy, and a lot of us do that already, with the employer across the street from the one who's paying crap wages subsidized by the government to an employer who's paying a living wage and offering the same product and the same service. I mean, it's a matter of competitive advantage. The small businesses I cited in Sitka, you know, where two employers, hell, they might pay more if they weren't competing with that other gallery owner who's paying $7.75. I mean, we talk about a race to the bottom nationally. We're in a race to the bottom in this country in the last few years. And one of the few things we can do to address that aspect of it, and besides just, you know, getting out of poverty, EITC is a big part of that. The EITC don't do a damn thing. It only exacerbates that competitive advantage of the low-road employer. And I think, and I hope, that Alaskans will take the opportunity to make material improvement in the lives of 48,000 people and their families. Maybe some of them are Alaska residents. They're still human beings. They're working in our state. They're contributing to our state. And I'm an old local hire zealot from way back. I gotta say that. But you know, if we need to bring people in to work in this state, and most of these people are Alaska residents that would be impacted by this increase, then we ought to take the opportunity. I hope we will take the opportunity to do that. And we've been talking a couple of years, and I'm hoping and expecting that, and I'll be showing you numbers just like I'm showing you for 2003, 2004, where if your answer to me is, yeah, jobs grew, but they would have grown 0.2% more if we had put in that damn minimum wage increase. Well, again, quantity of jobs up for whatever reason, quality of jobs in terms of pay up, we'll take that deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you both as panelists. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the audience. Great questions, rapt attention. I think this has been a really important opportunity to learn about a complex public policy issue. Informed citizens make all the difference in a democracy, and this is our effort to do that together. I do want to mention next steps. There are some follow-up resources at the Alaska Common Ground website. Some of the studies cited today are located there. There's some additional material that we would certainly encourage you to read if you're interested in it. Again, the broadcast or the recording will be available on the Common Ground website. This will be rebroadcast on KSKA. If you found this useful in helping you think your way through an issue important to us, please share that with your friends and invite them to visit the Alaska Common Ground website and follow up on some of this. So I think my thank yous are concluded. At this point, I'll ask Cliff to say a word to close.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our speakers again, Ed Flanagan and Kyle Hampton.